All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works? You send us something that's caught your eye,
Can
and we
we?
break it down, pulling out the really fascinating stuff. Basically, we take you from, that's interesting, to, wow, I actually get it now, pretty darn quickly.
Like,
A supercharged learning session.
exactly. And this time, we're tackling a book that dives into a pretty profound question.
Yeah.
How God changes your brain.
Ooh, that's a big one.
It is, it really is. And it's by Andrew Newberg, who's an MD, and Mark Robert Waldman.
So, right off the bat, we're dealing with the intersection of spirituality and neuroscience.
Absolutely. And it goes deep.
Like deep.
Yeah, like how thinking about God, praying, meditating, how all of that can actually change the physical structure of your brain.
Okay, so we're not just talking about feeling more peaceful or whatever.
Nope.
This is about real, measurable changes in the brain.
Real changes. We're talking neurons firing differently, new connections forming, the whole shebang.
So for anyone listening who's even a little bit skeptical, like, come on, how can that be?
I get.
We're going to unpack the science behind it, yeah.
Absolutely. We'll dig into the research, including some fascinating brain scan studies.
Oh, cool.
Dr. Newberg, one of the authors, is a pioneer in this field. He did groundbreaking work at the University of Pennsylvania using brain imaging to see what actually happens when people have these spiritual experiences.
Like literally looking inside people's brains while they're contemplating God.
Pretty much.
Yeah, that's wild. Okay, so let's get specific. If I'm someone who spends time thinking about God, praying or meditating, what tangible changes are happening in my brain?
Okay, so imagine this. You're contemplating the idea of God. Maybe you're deep in prayer or lost in meditation. What happens is your brain starts to rewire itself, like literally.
Hold on. Rewire?
Yeah, rewire. The neurons, those tiny brain cells, start to form new connections. And these connections, called synapses, are how neurons talk to each other.
So it's not just a fleeting thought. It's like physically etching new pathways in the brain.
Exactly. And as these pathways strengthen, it affects how you perceive things, how you feel. Even your most deeply held beliefs can shift.
So thinking about God can actually change what you believe.
It can. Because when something becomes super important to you, when it gives your life meaning, your brain takes notice. And it starts to weave this concept into your very sense of reality. The authors actually use the phrase neurologically real to describe this.
Virologically real, huh? That's a pretty powerful image.
Right. It's like God becomes less of an abstract idea and more of a lived experience embedded in your brain.
Fascinating. And this whole process of how we understand God, does it change over time, like as we grow up?
You know, that's one of the things the authors explore in the book. They talk about how when you ask a child to draw God, you often get these very human-like figures.
Yeah, like a big guy with a beard in the clouds.
Exactly. But when you ask adults, especially those who practice their faith regularly, their drawings become much more abstract.
So less man in the sky and more like symbols and metaphors.
Right. Which suggests that as we mature and our understanding of the world deepens, our concept of God also evolves, becoming more complex.
And how does the brain handle this shift towards a more abstract understanding?
Oh, well, the authors propose this intriguing idea that maybe we have a God neuron, or maybe a whole network of neurons.
Like a dedicated circuit for thinking about God.
Yeah, something like that. And the more we engage with these concepts, the more the circuit gets activated, grows, and refines itself. Kind of like a muscle, you know?
Use it or lose it.
Exactly. And here's another layer to it. The specific qualities we attribute to God, whether we see the divine as loving and forgiving or more judgmental and punishing, those ideas actually trigger different brain activity.
So thinking about a God of love literally lights up different parts of the brain than thinking about a God of wrath.
You got it.
Yeah.
And interestingly, if you look at how our culture's understanding of God has evolved over time, there's been a gradual shift away from the more authoritarian, fear-inducing image towards a more compassionate, loving one.
So our brains are reflecting this cultural shift too.
It seems that way. And there's a specific part of the brain, the anterior cingulate, that seems to be particularly important in processing this mystical dimension of God.
Now, you mentioned the anterior cingulate earlier.
I did, yeah.
If I remember correctly, it's involved in both our thoughts and emotions.
Spot on. It helps us balance those two, reason and feeling.
So it's like the bridge between head and heart.
A great way to put it. And the authors suggest that in today's world, with so many different spiritual beliefs out there, cultivating this part of the brain, this ability to hold multiple perspectives, is more important than ever.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about how thinking about God can change the brain. But what about practices like meditation and prayer? Do those have a measurable impact too?
You bet they do.
Hmm.
In fact, research that started around 2006 was specifically looking into whether meditation could help with memory problems.
Memory problems.
Yeah. You see, as we age, our brain's metabolism, the way it uses energy, starts to slow down after about 30.
Oh, I've heard about that. It's like our
Yeah.
brains get a little sluggish.
Well, kinda, yeah. And this can affect all sorts of cognitive functions, including memory. But meditation seems to be like a tune-up for the brain.
Like a brain workout.
Exactly. It exercises the brain in ways that our normal day-to-day activities don't. There was one study that focused on a specific type of meditation called Kirtan Kriya,
Kirtan Kriya, got it.
and they found that it activates a very specific circuit in the brain.
Oh, so it's not just random brain activity. There's a targeted pathway.
That's right. This circuit involves the prefrontal cortex, which is all about focus and planning,
Right?
the anterior cingulate, which we talked about for empathy and social awareness,
Yep.
the basal ganglia, which is involved in movement and emotion regulation,
Not it?
and the thalamus, which helps us process sensory information.
Wow. That's a lot of brain areas working together.
It is. And this circuit is super important because it's involved in our conscious awareness, how clearly we think, how we perceive reality, our ability to spot mistakes, and even how well we manage emotions like anger and fear.
So basically, this circuit helps us function as healthy, well-adjusted human beings.
You could say that, yeah. And what they found in the study is that this particular type of meditation actually strengthens this circuit, which tends to weaken as we get older.
Oh, so it's like a preventative measure against age-related decline.
Exactly. And if the circuit gets messed up, it's been linked to conditions like depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, even schizophrenia.
Whoa, so meditation isn't just about feeling calmer. It could have a real impact on our mental health.
It really could. And it goes beyond just temporarily changing brain activity. Consistent meditation or prayer can actually change the physical structure of the brain.
How's that possible?
So neurons communicate with each other through these little junctions called synapses. When we meditate or pray regularly, it strengthens those connections, making them more efficient. Over time, it can even change the way our brain cells themselves are structured. Pretty amazing, huh?
Mind-blowing, really. So what we focus our attention on, what we consistently think about, actually shapes our brains.
Mm.
But what about the physical act of meditation or prayer, like our breathing, for example?
Oh yeah, breathing is huge.
How so?
Well, our breath is directly connected to the systems that control our emotions and how we process sensory information. So when we take slow, deep breaths, it calms us down both physically and mentally. It also gives our frontal lobe a bit of an energy boost, which is important because that part of the brain is always working hard.
So taking a few deep breaths can actually help us think more clearly.
Exactly. Now, there's another fascinating concept. The book explores the power of expectation.
Expectation.
Yeah, like when we really believe that something is going to happen, this is closely tied to the idea of faith.
So how does expectation work on the brain level?
Well, our brains are wired to believe in our ability to achieve things. When we have a strong expectation, a conviction that something is possible, it triggers our immune system and motivates us to take action.
So it's not just wishful thinking, it's actually priming our bodies for success.
Exactly. And this ties into what's known as the placebo effect. If you truly believe that something will have a certain effect, your body can actually respond as if it were true.
So our mindset, our beliefs, can actually influence our biology.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, the book also looks at how these contemplative practices can help protect our brains as we age.
That's something I think a lot of people are concerned about.
For sure. And the evidence suggests that pretty much any kind of contemplative practice, whether it's meditation, prayer, or something else, can boost cognitive function. The specific type of meditation they studied in the book, that Kirtan Kriya we talked about earlier, they think it's particularly effective because it combines 6 different things that all have an impact on the brain.
6 things. Like what?
So you've got relaxation, focused breathing, repeating sounds or mantras, coordinated finger movements, background music, and intense concentration.
Wow, that's like a multi-pronged approach.
It is. A lot of other meditation practices only use 1 or 2 of those elements. And another thing to consider is the impact of stress on our brains, especially on those dendrites, the little branches of neurons that receive information.
So stress is bad for dendrites.
Yeah, even short bursts of stress can mess with their structure and how they grow, which can affect our memory. And chronic stress, that's even worse. It can lead to those dendrites actually dying off.
Yikes, that's not good.
Yeah.
So finding ways to manage stress is super important for brain health.
Totally. Now, let's talk about rituals. The book dives into how they fit into this whole brain-spirituality connection.
Okay, so when we think of rituals, we often think about religious ceremonies.
Right, but rituals can also be personal practices, things we do consistently that have meaning for us.
Like a morning routine or something.
Exactly. And the key thing about rituals is that they add weight to our beliefs. They make abstract concepts more concrete and personally relevant. And the more intensely we engage in a ritual, the more likely we are to have a powerful, even transformative experience.
So it's not just about going through the motions, it's about the intention and focus we bring to it.
That's it. Now, studying the effects of rituals on the brain is tricky because there are so many variables.
Like if you're looking at a church service, there's singing, praying, listening to a sermon.
Yeah, it's hard to isolate what's doing what. But early research does suggest that different aspects of rituals can change how we think and feel about God.
Interesting. The book also mentions how meditation actually has roots in Christianity, which might surprise some people.
I know, right? We tend to associate meditation with Eastern traditions.
Yeah, like Buddhism or Hinduism.
But there are actually about 20 references to meditation in the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, like Isaac went out to meditate in the fields, and the followers of Joshua were told to meditate on the law. And even prayer itself can be seen as a form of meditation, focusing our thoughts and intentions.
So meditation is more universal than we might think.
It is. And even within Christian history, there have been figures like Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk who was really into Eastern contemplative practices.
So he brought those ideas into Christianity.
He did, yeah.
Huh.
Now, the book introduces this concept of the neural construction of God. What that means is different parts of our brain contribute to how we experience God, the universe, and our own lives.
Okay, break that down for me.
So, for example, our frontal lobes, the part of the brain that's responsible for planning, decision-making, that kind of stuff.
Right.
That's where we process the more logical, rational aspects of God. Like, if you believe in a God who is just, loving, that's your frontal lobes at work.
Okay, what about the more emotional side of spirituality?
That's where the limbic system comes in. That's the older, more primitive part of the brain that deals with emotions.
So feeling a sense of awe or connection with the divine, that's the limbic system.
Exactly. And when these different brain areas aren't working together properly, it can lead to some strange experiences. Like some people with brain damage become obsessed with religious ideas.
Or the opposite, they lose all interest in spirituality.
That can happen too. And then there's the occipital cortex, which is all about vision. That's where we process those images of God that we might have.
Like if you picture God as a man with a beard, that's your occipital cortex.
Yeah, or if you see God as a bright light or some other visual representation. And then there's the temporal lobes, which are involved in hearing. So if you believe you're hearing God's voice, that's your temporal lobes.
Interesting. So all these different parts of the brain contribute to our overall spiritual experience.
They do. And it gets even more complex. The parietal lobe, which is involved in our sense of self, seems to play a role in those experiences where people feel like they're losing themselves, like during deep prayer or meditation.
Like a sense of oneness with the universe.
Yeah, something like that. And then there's the thalamus, that relay station for sensory information.
We talked about that before.
Right. The thalamus doesn't really differentiate between what's real and what's imagined. So if you deeply contemplate something like the nature of God, it can start to feel completely real to you.
So our beliefs, even if they're not based on external reality, can become neurologically real.
Exactly. And the brain will respond accordingly. Now, the book also talks about the chemical nature of God.
Meaning there are actual chemicals in the brain involved in spiritual experiences.
You got it. It's all about neurotransmitters, those chemicals that neurons use to communicate with each other.
Right.
And there's one neurotransmitter in particular that's linked to spirituality, dopamine.
Dopamine, that's the feel-good chemical, right?
It is. It's involved in pleasure, reward, motivation, all that good stuff. And there's a specific meditation practice, yoga nidra,
Okay.
that's been shown to boost dopamine levels by a whopping 65%.
Wow, that's huge.
It is. And that might explain why some people say that intense spiritual experiences feel similar to being on drugs.
Because both can trigger those same reward pathways in the brain.
Precisely.
Right.
Now, let's talk about how our understanding of God is evolving, even on a neurological level.
Like, how are we reinventing God as a society?
Well, all of our experiences, whether they're religious or not, exist on a spectrum of intensity. The very word God can evoke all sorts of different reactions in people.
Like Some people feel joy, others feel fear.
Or anger, or peace, or nothing at all.
And what about atheists? How do their brains respond to the idea of God?
Interestingly, brain scans have shown a mix of responses. Some atheists show signs of mental conflict when they think about God.
Like their brains are struggling with the concept?
Yeah, while others show no change at all, which suggests that atheism itself isn't a monolithic thing. It comes in many flavors.
So different brains, different reactions.
For sure. And then there's neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and adapt.
That's a concept we've talked about a lot on the show.
And for good reason. It's one of the most amazing things about the brain. And research shows that practices like meditation can actually enhance neuroplasticity, even counteracting the natural thinning of the brain that happens as we age.
So we can actually make our brains more resilient.
Absolutely. And this ties into the idea that spiritual experiences can lead to real changes in our beliefs.
Meaning they can shake up our worldview.
They can. Many people who have had profound spiritual experiences say that their understanding of God has changed, often becoming less external and more of an internal force.
Like God isn't out there somewhere, but within them.
Exactly. And this shift is reflected in how religious institutions themselves are evolving. Many churches are becoming more liberal, moving away from strict dogma.
And we're seeing the rise of what's called spiritual but not religious.
Right. People are finding their own paths, often blending different traditions and practices.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a constantly changing world.
It is. It is. The authors argue that this ongoing evolution of religion and spirituality is a good thing, forcing us to think deeply about our values, our place in the universe, and how we want to live our lives.
It's about asking those big questions and being open to new perspectives.
Totally. Now, remember that exercise we talked about earlier, asking people to draw God?
Yeah, the kids drawing the man in the clouds.
Well, when you compare the drawings of adults who are actively engaged in spirituality to those of children, there's a clear difference. Adults tend to create much more abstract images.
So less literal and more symbolic.
Right. They might use symbols of infinity or interconnectedness or even mirrors to represent the relationship between themselves and the divine. And what's interesting is non-religious adults and atheists also show this tendency towards abstraction.
So it's not just a religious thing, it's a developmental thing.
It seems that way. As our brains mature and we encounter more complexity in the world, our understanding of God, or whatever we consider the ultimate reality, becomes more nuanced.
More layered, more multifaceted.
Exactly. Now, there's another interesting concept the book brings up, the idea of a critical God.
Critical God.
Yeah, basically it's the belief that God judges us in the afterlife, but doesn't really intervene in our daily lives.
Like he's keeping score, but not actively helping or hindering us.
Kinda, yeah. And surprisingly, a lot of people hold this view across different religious backgrounds.
So it's not limited to any one particular faith.
Nope. And then the book goes on to explore how the concept of the divine has been expressed in so many different ways throughout history and across cultures.
Like how many different faces does God have?
Right. For example, in Islam, there are 99 attributes of Allah, encompassing a whole range of qualities, from love and mercy to justice and power.
So it's a much broader view than just a God who punishes.
Definitely. And in Eastern traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, the concept of divinity is often expressed through a multitude of gods and goddesses, each representing different aspects of reality.
And even within Judaism, there's been a shift over time from a more fear-based understanding of God to one that emphasizes ethics and morality.
You see that in a lot of religions, this evolution towards a more compassionate and understanding God.
So our understanding of the divine is constantly evolving.
It is. And the book highlights a particular Christian denomination, the Unity School of Christianity.
Unity School.
Okay. Which believes that God is a benevolent presence within each person, and that we can tap into that divine power through positive thinking and prayer.
So it's a more individualized and empowering approach to spirituality?
Exactly. Now, the book also talks about the inner conflict we all experience.
Like the battle between good and evil.
Kind of, yeah. But they frame it more as a tension between our selfish impulses and our capacity for kindness and compassion.
So it's like the angel and the devil on our shoulders.
Right. And they use that analogy of the two wolves, the one we feed is the one that grows stronger.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one.
And they point out that getting caught up in this inner struggle can actually be harmful. It's better to focus on cultivating the positive, the kindness and compassion, rather than obsessing over the negative.
So starving the selfish wolf and feeding the kind wolf.
Exactly. And when we actively practice kindness and fairness, it can lead to what's called reciprocal altruism, where others are more likely to be kind back to us.
It's like a positive feedback loop.
It is. And it also stimulates the anterior cingulate, which we've talked about, the part of the brain that's crucial for empathy and compassion.
And the book also touches on the whole us versus them mentality,
Oh, that's a big one, especially in today's world.
where everyone seems so divided.
Right. And the book points out that our brains are wired to see our own beliefs as true, even when evidence contradicts them.
It's like we have blinders on.
Kinda, yeah. And this happens on both sides of an issue, whether it's religious or political or anything else.
So both sides think they're right and the other side is wrong.
Exactly. And our brains hate inconsistency, so we tend to cling to our beliefs, even when they're challenged.
So how do we break out of this cycle of division?
The authors suggest something pretty simple. Try to avoid labeling yourself and others. Like, don't think of yourself as a Christian or a Democrat or an American.
Because those labels create those us versus them categories.
Right. And they also point out that fundamentalists, especially men, tend to have higher levels of anxiety and distrust.
So fear and suspicion fuel those rigid beliefs.
Yeah. And the best way to counter that is with understanding and compassion, trying to see the other person's perspective.
Easier said than done, but definitely worth striving for.
Absolutely. And the book also warns against the dangers of authoritarianism, even when it's disguised as something noble.
Like using religion to justify violence.
Or any ideology, really. They talk about the Stanford prison experiment, where ordinary people were put into roles of guards and prisoners.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. It showed how easily people can abuse power.
Exactly. And when you combine that with a strong ideology, it can be a recipe for disaster.
So it's not religion itself that's the problem, it's how it's used.
That's right. Now, on a more positive note, the book also talks about the benefits of religious and spiritual involvement.
Okay, so being religious or spiritual is generally a good thing.
It seems that way. As long as it's not centered around fear and authoritarianism, engaging in spiritual practices can actually be good for our health and well-being.
Like going to church or meditating can actually help you live longer.
There's some evidence to suggest that, yeah. And the book offers some practical tips for exercising our brains beyond just meditation.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So one thing they recommend is listening to happy music.
Like upbeat, feel-good tunes.
Exactly. It can lift our mood and even trigger us to smile, which can be really helpful if we're dealing with stress or illness.
So crank up those happy tunes.
And another thing is to stay intellectually active. Keep learning new things, challenging your brain.
Like doing crossword puzzles or reading books.
Exactly. That helps keep those neural connections strong, especially in the frontal lobe, which is important for planning, problem solving, all those higher order thinking skills.
So use it or lose it applies to the brain too.
Big time. And cultivating a sense of optimism is also huge. It reduces stress hormones, helps us cope with challenges, and might even help us live longer.
So looking on the bright side is actually good for our brains.
It is. And then there's the power of imagination. The authors emphasize that imagination is the first step towards achieving anything.
Like we have to be able to envision something before we can make it happen.
Exactly. And that's where faith comes in, believing in our ability to achieve our dreams.
So it's a combination of vision and belief.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about breath awareness.
You mentioned that earlier.
Right. It's a simple but powerful practice. Basically, you just focus on your breath, noticing the sensations of each inhale and exhale.
So it's easy enough.
It is, but it can be surprisingly challenging at first. Our minds tend to wander.
Oh yeah, I know all about that.
But with practice, it gets easier. And what breath awareness does is it slows down that mental chatter and help us become more present in the moment.
So it's a way to quiet the mind.
Exactly. And it also seems to affect brain activity. It increases activity in the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain, and decreases activity in the frontal lobe, the thinking part.
So it's like shifting from thinking to feeling.
Yeah, you could say that. And the book includes a simple breath awareness exercise you can try.
I might have to check that out. They also talk about progressive muscle relaxation.
Yes, that's another great technique for calming down the body and mind. You basically go through each muscle group in your body, tensing and then relaxing them.
Sounds relaxing.
It is. And the book has step-by-step instructions for that too.
Awesome. And they also highlight the power of visualization and guided imagery.
Right. Our brains are constantly creating mental images, even when we're not consciously aware of it. And visualization is about harnessing that power. intentionally creating images that align with our goals or desired emotional states.
Like if you want to feel more peaceful, you might visualize yourself in a serene setting.
Exactly. Or if you have a goal you're working towards, you might visualize yourself achieving it.
And the more vividly we can imagine something, the more likely it is to manifest in our lives.
That's the idea. Visualization can also be helpful for dealing with difficult memories. By intentionally creating different images, we can start to shift our emotional response to those memories.
So it's a way to rewire our brains, to create new associations.
Exactly. Now, the book also offers guidance on managing negative emotions, specifically anger.
Anger is a tough one.
It is. It can be really destructive to relationships, to communication, to pretty much everything.
And it often leads to more anger.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle. And the authors emphasize that expressing anger directly, like yelling or lashing out,
Usually makes things worse.
right, it tends to trigger defensiveness in the other person, escalating the conflict.
So what's a better approach?
They recommend becoming more aware of our anger, noticing the subtle signs before it explodes, and they suggest a meditation practice for cultivating kindness and forgiveness.
Even towards people who've wronged us.
Even then, it's about trying to see their humanity, even if their actions have been hurtful.
That's a tall order.
It is. But with practice, it becomes easier. And the book even suggests starting difficult conversations with a genuine compliment.
Like finding something positive to say, even if you're about to disagree.
Exactly. It helps to soften the blow and create a more receptive atmosphere.
That's a good tip. Finally, let's talk about compassionate communication.
Yes, the art of communicating with empathy and understanding.
It's something I think we could all use a little more of.
Agreed. Compassionate communication is all about being present, listening deeply, and trying to understand the other person's perspective, even if you don't agree with them.
So it's about connection rather than conflict.
Exactly. And research shows that it can actually improve relationship satisfaction, reduce stress and anxiety, and even boost our cognitive and emotional functioning.
Wow, so many benefits.
There are. And one of the key things about compassionate communication is being able to regulate our own emotions.
So staying calm and centered, even when things get heated.
That's it. And the book has some great tips for doing that, like taking a few deep breaths, softening your tone of voice, and avoiding accusatory language.
It's about creating a safe space for open and honest dialogue.
Absolutely. And the book even talks about how our own inner state can influence the people around us.
Like if we're calm and peaceful, others are more likely to feel that way too.
Exactly. It's all about those mirror neurons, those brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing the same action.
So we literally mirror each other's emotions.
We do, and that's why it's so important to cultivate those positive emotions within ourselves. The book even includes a secret desire exercise that often reveals a shift in people's priorities after they've been practicing meditation.
Oh, what's that?
Basically, you write down your deepest desires, the things you truly long for in life. And after a period of meditation, people often find that their desires have shifted away from material things and towards more intrinsic values, like peace, happiness, and connection.
So meditation can actually change what we want out of life.
It seems that way. And the book emphasizes that relaxation is key to effective communication. So before you have a difficult conversation, take some time to calm down, center yourself, and focus on your breath.
That's good advice. And the book also offers some specific guidelines for compassionate dialogue.
Like choosing the right time to talk, opening with kindness, avoiding provocative language, softening your tone, suspending blame, respecting the other person's view, making sure both people get to share equally, and closing with kindness.
It's like a recipe for healthy communication.
It is. And they also talk about the pay it forward concept, how small acts of kindness can ripple outwards.
Like one person's generosity can inspire others to be more generous.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we're all interconnected and that our actions have a wider impact than we might realize.
Well, be kind. It's contagious.
It really is. And lastly, the book touches on adolescence, that time of life when kids are figuring out who they are and what they believe.
Yeah, that can be a tumultuous time.
It is. And the authors point out that during adolescence, the brain is going through a major rewiring process, and that's why teenagers often question everything, including their religious beliefs.
It's a natural part of growing up.
It is. It's about testing the boundaries and forming their own independent worldview.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into how God changes your brain, it's clear that the way we think about and interact with the divine, whether through prayer, meditation, or simply contemplation, has a profound impact on our brains.
And vice versa, how our brains are wired influences our spiritual experiences.
It's a fascinating interplay between the physical and the metaphysical.
It really is. And the key takeaway is that our brains are constantly changing, adapting, and evolving throughout our lives. And through practices like meditation and compassionate communication, we can actually shape those changes for the better.
So we're not just stuck with the brain we're born with, we have the power to rewire it.
We do. And that's a pretty empowering thought.
It is. And for you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for the incredible complexity and plasticity of your own brain.
And maybe even sparked some new questions and insights.
And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those brains firing.
Because the more we understand about how our brains work, the more we can harness their power to create a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
And who knows, maybe even change the world for the better.
Maybe so.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.